And now we're starting with cluster B, but before we do here, I would like to quiz you. So cluster A is representative of what kind of thought processes and behaviors? Pause this video a minute if you don't think of the answer immediately, and then turn it back on for the answer. And the answer, of course, is odd and eccentric thought processes and behaviors. What about cluster B? And the answer to this one, A, is dramatic and erratic. Dramatic and erratic. We all know what dramatic means. What does erratic mean? And you might have known that it means it changes a lot, right? And then what about cluster C coming up here in a little bit? And the answer to that one is anxious and fearful. So thought processes and behaviors that are anxious and fearful. So now we are looking at cluster B. And cluster B, the first one that we're going to examine here is antisocial personality disorder. Remember, I told you that you need to get really good notes on these disorders. You can't just go with what's on the slide. You want much better notes than that. And you might have noticed already that there's some overlap with syndrome. I've given you some little cues for teasing some apart, some of the disorders apart from each other, because there is some overlap of symptoms. In fact, you know, a couple of the symptoms that we see in antisocial, we're also going to see in like narcissistic personality disorder. So what's really important is that when you make a judgment on the test or on our practice case studies or in the videos that we look at in a little bit in this lecture segment, that you look at the big picture before coming up with your guess on the diagnosis. You really need to look at the big picture. You can't just look at one or two symptoms, or it's too easy to get one of these wrong. So antisocial personality disorder is characterized by a disregard for the rights of others. So a disregard for how the consequences of your behavior might affect others. And it says here in the slide, a conduct behavior. Okay, so conduct behavior always, but you can even look back in childhood records because this is oftentimes recorded in school before anybody is actually diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, with a personality disorder, right? When they're in school, even grade school and younger. So what we mean by conduct behaviors, though, well, for children, it could be running away. And for people of any age, it can be pathological lying, theft, arson, vandalism, getting into fights with people. The most extreme, which most people with this disorder don't engage in at all, but in the most extreme ends, we're talking rape and murder even. Okay. People with this disorder tend to be manipulative and exploitative. So they tend to exploit others without any remorse. Okay? They can be very deceitful. They can be charming, but they can also be very deceitful. They tend to be irritable. And if they're irritated enough, okay, can be physically aggressive. There's some impulse control problems here. And so not uncommon for somebody with antisocial personality disorder to be in default on debts. Okay, so they might owe on loans and have defaulted on their payments. They might engage in other impulsive and or reckless behaviors. Okay. Most kids who show conduct behaviors, by the way, they get over it. They get over it by the time they're 18 or old enough to be diagnosed, so they're never diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. But, you know, some of them don't. Now, this next one is borderline personality disorder. And this is characterized by instability and impulsivity in relationships and mood. So if you think about it, if you look at antisocial, what we just covered, that is kind of dramatic, right? But if you look at borderline, it's going to more focus on that erratic part. Okay. So instability, meaning their moods and how they feel about others in their life, relationships, can really change at the drop of a hat. Okay. Borderline personality disorder is very difficult, not just for the people who suffer from this disorder, but for those who are close to them. Oftentimes they have a very erratic sense of self. So they don't have a clear idea of what their values are, where their loyalties lay. This will also mean that there's oftentimes not a clear idea of who they are, what their career plans are. And their feelings about others, can swing really dramatically and abruptly as their moods can. So, for instance, I'm reminded of a woman whose husband was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And he could be very loving. This was very difficult for her to handle. But he could also be very loving, and she had decided to stick it out and to be with him. And they were celebrating their anniversary, and he took her to the lake on which they were married before. And they went out, they rented a canoe, and they went out in the canoe, and it's beautiful and it's romantic. And he's telling her how much he loves her and how she has really enriched his life. And then some little thing happened. I don't even remember it was so little, but some little thing happened that just set him off. And before she knew it, he was yelling at her that she had ruined all these opportunities in his life, and that he wished he'd never married her, and he actually pushed her out of the canoe. Okay. Now, she could swim. This wasn't, didn't cause a catastrophe, except for her, of course, emotionally. But, their feelings about somebody in their life can swing from very passionate idealization to a real contemptuous kind of anger. So very difficult for them. They're experiencing these feelings, right? Also very difficult on their families and the people who love them and care about them. Borderline personality disorder. There's a lot of impulsive behavior with borderline. And who do they have that in common with? Antisocial personality disorder, right? And you're going to see that running through this cluster a lot, but impulsive behavior, so not unusual that people with borderline personality are addicted to something. Now that something can really vary. And, it might be gambling. It might be alcohol. It might be drugs. It might be overeating. It might be spending money. Okay. There are huge abandonment issues with the borderline personality. Fear of being alone, really demanding the attention of the other people in their life. Real fear of being alone. In fact, and they can become very manipulative because of this fear of abandonment and this need to attention, to the point where let's say they have a spouse who is talking about leaving them, to the point where they might even threaten suicide. Now, that threat is not necessarily an empty threat, because in fact, people with borderline personality disorder are far more likely to commit suicide than general members of the population. They have a much higher rate of suicide actually following through on it. Okay. There was a movie that was out. It's an older movie, but some of you might be familiar with it, where I think it might be Richard Gere in it, but it's called Fatal Attraction. And the female main character in this movie really It shows a lot of signs of borderline personality disorder. And actually, you're sitting on the edge of your seat all the way through this movie because you cannot figure out if she's going to do him in or if she's going to do herself in. And so again, that movie is called Fatal Attraction.